When the icy wind slammed against his face, that November morning veteran Daniel Walker realized he had officially become a man with nothing because the landlord had thrown him out without mercy. The job he once depended on had shut down, and the life he built after returning from service had collapsed into dust faster than he expected. And all he had left in the world was his loyal German shepherd Max, who stood beside him in the cold with the same calm determination he always carried and wore. Daniel stared at the roadside where their belongings lay scattered inside a torn duffel and a trash bag filled with clothes, and he wondered how life could twist so fast, leaving him homeless and hopeless. But even as his chest tightened with frustration and fear, he knew one thing: he would not break again, not after everything he survived overseas, and not with Max watching him like a beacon of strength. And before the story continues, deeper please like, comment, share, and subscribe if you believe in kindness, hope, and second chances, because stories like this carry real meaning for people who are struggling quietly. Daniel drove across Wyoming searching for anything he could afford, even the smallest abandoned lot somewhere in the countryside, and he kept praying for one last chance while Max rested his head on Daniel's shoulder from the passenger seat, as if reminding him he wasn't alone. The truck sputtered and rattled as the temperature dropped below freezing, and the road stretched endlessly until Daniel noticed a handwritten sign nailed to a leaning post saying, "For sale, Quonset, $5, must move today, Daniel." Blinked thinking he misread it, but when he stopped and walked toward the property, he saw it clearly: an old rustic Quonset hut slumped in the middle of a barren field, bent metal sides, cracked frame, and patches of rust covering the entire arch. It looked like something abandoned since the 1950s, maybe older, but Daniel felt a strange pull toward it, because even broken things can still be rebuilt, and he was living proof of that. He found the owner, a man in his 70s, who explained that the land was being cleared for new construction, and the Quonset needed to go immediately or be destroyed. Daniel reached into his pocket, counted the last crumpled bills he had, and handed the man $5 without hesitation. It was all he had, but he figured owning something broken was still better than owning nothing at all, with Max wagging his tail as if approving the decision. Moving the Quonset was nearly impossible, but Daniel dismantled it piece by piece, loading the rusted panels into his truck. Over the course of 2 frozen days, his fingers numbed by the cold, but his heart warmed by purpose. Because rebuilding something gave him the strength he forgot. He drove the pieces to a small piece of unused land on the outskirts of town. Land no one cared about, land he did not technically own, but hoped no one would bother him for staying there just long enough to put his life back in order. Max slept curled beside him in the cab each night, keeping him warm to the bitter cold mornings, and during the daylight hours, Daniel worked nonstop, hammering, scraping, cleaning, bending, and reinforcing the curved metal, until one day a structure finally stood, a rusted archway patched with determination and faith, but still not enough to withstand a brutal winter. Daniel scavenged old lumber scrap, insulation, broken pallets, metal sheets, anything he could find near junkyards, construction sites, or abandoned barns. And Max became his silent helper, carrying smaller pieces in his mouth, fetching tools, dragging rope when needed, and staying alert for danger. They rebuilt the Quonset together, not into something pretty, but into something strong enough to protect them from cold storms and loneliness. Daniel sealed the gaps, covered the interior walls with scavenged boards, and used clay and straw to insulate the inside layer by layer, and slowly the Quonset changed from a rusted frame into a shelter, a refuge, a home, even if no one else would dare call it. That neighbors who passed by laughed at him, saying the structure looked like it would collapse in the next windstorm, or accusing him of trespassing and telling him to move on. But Daniel ignored them, because he finally had a place to sleep that wasn't the back of a truck, and every night when the temperature dropped, he and Max curled together under blankets, and thanked God for giving them warmth from the simplest materials. He had learned in the Army how to survive with very little, and those skills returned instinctively, building a stove from a metal barrel, digging a trench around the structure to keep water from flooding the ground, and creating shelves from broken crates. He even dug a shallow root cellar behind the Quonset, storing food in the cold ground so they would never run out during storms. Days turned into weeks, and slowly Daniel and Max built the Quonset into something remarkable, something nobody expected, something that shocked everyone who thought a rusted $5 hut would never hold through winter. Because once Daniel installed a simple geothermal venting path, he learned from an old manual the inside temperature began rising naturally thanks to the underground heat, and while the ground above froze solid, the interior of the Quonset stayed warm even without a heater. Max seemed Fascinated, curling near the warm spots, Daniel discovered that the metal structure being curved and enclosed trapped heat efficiently, like a natural oven, and soon the Quonset felt as warm as the small cabin neighbors who mocked him fell silent when they saw steam rising from the roof on freezing nights, indicating internal warmth, and still they didn't know the full truth. Daniel and Max had built something that would save dozens of people by the end of winter. One night in late December, a brutal snowstorm swept through the region, cutting power. Across 3 counties, temperatures dropped to dangerous levels, and dozens of travelers were stranded on the highway that ran near Daniel's land. Daniel heard the distant cries of people calling for help, and Max immediately barked and pushed at the door, demanding they go outside. Daniel grabbed extra blankets, flashlights, and his army pack, and together Max pushed through the storm, guiding T. 3 families, 2 elderly couples, and a teenage boy toward the only structure still warm for miles. The Quonset. Daniel brought them inside, wrapped them in blankets, and gave them heated water and canned food from his tiny supply. Max lay beside the children, keeping them warm with his body heat. For hours the wind assaulted the metal walls, but the structure held, and when rescue teams arrived hours later, they were stunned that the interior remained warm. Without electricity or fire, Daniel shrugged, quietly saying he built it piece by piece with God's help, and the dog who never gave up on him word his heroic act spread. Quickly neighbors who once mocked him came bringing food, tools, blankets, and supplies, apologizing for judging him, and amazed by what he built. Reporters tried to interview him, but he refused attention, saying he only did what anyone with a heart should do during winter. As the storm season continued, Daniel and Max turned the Quonset into a safe point for stranded drivers, hikers, and workers who lost heat in their homes, helping nearly 20 people survive the cold months. And each time Max alerted Daniel, before anyone even reached the door, because a dog's instinct was sharper than any alarm system. And near the end of the story, if it touched your heart even a little, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, because your support helps real stories of courage and survival reach more people in need of hope. And before we end, please comment below which moment in Daniel and Max's journey moved you the most. When spring finally arrived, the snow melted, revealing the Quonset no longer rusted or broken, but restored shelter strengthened by perseverance, love, and faith. City officials offered Daniel a job maintaining rescue cabins in the region, impressed by his skills and heart, and a landowner donated the small plot Daniel had been living on, saying the world needed people like him. Daniel stood outside the Quonset one warm morning, Max sitting proudly beside him as sunlight glowed across the metal walls. And he realized that being kicked out with nothing wasn't the end of his life, but the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter built from scrap, hope, grit, and the loyalty of a dog who believed in him long before the world did. And in that quiet moment, watching the breeze ripple through the grass, Daniel whispered thank you to God, to Max, and to the broken, rusted $5 Quonset that became the miracle he never saw coming.